right, welcome everybody. This is the Founder Underground podcast. I am your host, Ian Scott Cohen, and this is where we dive deep into the tactics, strategies, and mindsets that help early stage and aspiring entrepreneurs turn their big ideas into actual thriving and sustainable businesses. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by Maura Shenker, a true force in the world of entrepreneurship and economic equity. Maura, how are you this morning?
I am great.
Thank you
Great
so
to
much
see
for
you.
being with us. Yes, it's great to see you as well. So let me give you a little bit of background about Maura. Today, we're talking all about funding, which for any entrepreneur, whether you're a nonprofit or for-profit, whatever it may be, funding is always top of mind. So we're going to explore funding options beyond venture capital because a lot of us seem to think VCs are the only capital out there, which they are not. We're going to talk about when and how to pursue things like non-dilutive government grants, foundation grants, that kind of thing. And we'll also talk about and touch on, how to decide between debt and equity financing. But first, a bit about Maura. So Maura really has an incredible background. So from leading a $7+ million national program at the US SBA, so that's a Small Business Administration for those folks unfamiliar, to building Temple University's Small Business Development Center. Shout out to Temple, my mom's alma mater, and go Philly. She turned that into a powerhouse for job creation and community impact. She's also a respected thought leader, contributing insights to organizations like the Clinton Foundation and Brookings Institution. I think also the Pew Research Center too. So some really big names in the world of thought and theory, in addition to doing tons of amazing work directly with organizations around fundraising. And I've seen her work in action in first person as we've both supported organizations and companies in same programs. So Maura's passion for creating opportunities and empowering underserved communities is unmatched. So I'm excited to learn from you today, Maura. So let's dive right in and start with kind of a broad question. So for many entrepreneurs, venture capital feels like the default funding option. And so can you share why it might not be the best fit for most businesses and what other funding options at a high level are out there?
Sure. Well, I would say the exact opposite, that venture capital is like the worst. It's a shot. Yeah, it's a shot in the dark. A lot of people think of venture capital because it's sexy and exciting.
Sure. Yeah.
But the number of actual businesses that receive venture capital is so low.
Yeah.
Um, that it's a pipe dream. I mean, you might as well be like, I want to be a rock star. I think you might actually have a better chance
Yeah, it
of
might be equivalent
becoming
odds.
a
Absolutely.
rock star or a movie star as to getting venture capital. So there are other funds, especially for social impact based businesses, but
Sure. Yeah.
the type of funding that your business needs really depends on the type of business you have.
Yeah.
So if you're not in a high growth, could be a unicorn company that will quickly return crazy dividends, then VC isn't really going to be interesting. VC is
Yeah.
not patient capital. And
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. Yeah. It's one of those things that I think the startup and sort of tech scene kind of took over the conversation about entrepreneurship more generally over the last, 20 years since social media blew up, the internet blew up. And now it's this place where I've found people who are starting, local retail businesses and thinking that they need to go for venture capital. And so to your point, you say high growth, right? And so just so we all know kind of what that means, venture capitalists, so they might go out and raise a fund of, if they're really small, they might $25 million. And they get it from all sorts of investors, foundations, endowments, companies, sometimes individuals. And they're expecting, or they're trying, I should say, to turn that 25 million into 250 million in returns, right? And so in order to do that, to your point, you've got to be able to grow super fast, like, within 5 to 7 years, ideally for them, if not sooner, right? And so that's just not true for most businesses, right?
absolutely. So take your example. I'm going to use easier numbers. I'm
Sure.
going to say I have $10 million. And so as a VC, I'm going to invest $1 million into 10 companies for half because they're so early.
Yeah.
They think they're worth something. I'm going to get half of their equity. I'm going to take 50% equity. So we're
Sure.
co-owners. I'll take 49%. I'll leave them.
Yeah. Appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I'm really kind, very generous.
Right. Right.
Companies one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, and nine go bust. And I have
Yeah.
now lost $9 million. But
Right.
company 10 hits it and they sell to, I don't know,
Microsoft.
Google. Yep.
Yeah.
You
Google.
went
Whatever.
Microsoft, I went Google, but
Yeah.
we're in the same there. We're in the same area there. For $1 billion. Now my $1 million return, I own 50% of that company. I get half of that money.
Right.
So I only need to hit once. And I'm willing to take the risk on the others because when I hit that once, it more than covers all the other losses and
Yeah.
then some.
Right. Right. And this
And it's
is this is what a lot of folks call like the power law in venture capital, which is honestly, I know a lot of VCs and they're really great people, smart people, but like I hate some of the rules of thumb and just like ideas that they all operate in. Because to your point, like not only do most venture capital backed businesses end up failing, but most venture capital funds end up failing, like the firms themselves. And so it's not like these people have some sort of crystal ball where they know how to pick them. It's right now it's turned into this very much like kind of let me throw at a dartboard, let me find the one that's already got a bunch of funding and hop on the back of them, right? There's a lot of that going on.
You also have to understand, I know this sounds weird, but a lot of the people with money who are investing in these funds are looking for a write-up.
Mm,
Like, um, it's my same, it's the same way that people think about uh, starting foundations. When you have so much money that you endow your own foundation,
yeah,
it's really just a way to avoid paying taxes and control how your money is being spent.
yep, yep.
Uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
so,
It's a great point. It's that's why it's important to look at VCs and any money as a financial instrument, right? At the end of the day, from your perspective as an entrepreneur, it's about your business, to your point that you mentioned at the top. It really depends on what your business type is, where you are with that business, what your goals are for that business. And then you look, if you even need money to grow, if you have a compelling reason to try to grow more quickly than just methodically and organically. Ideally, well, maybe not ideally to everybody, but a lot of most businesses out there that are successful, they start maybe they get a small loan or something, or they put a little bit of investment from the founders themselves, and then they grow organically, meaning they get more customers, they make more money than they spend, they reinvest into their business, and they grow that way. Venture capital, to kind of put a bookend onto them, because I don't want to spend more time talking about them, they get enough airtime as it is. They are really meant to accelerate growth. And so if you've got something that has a huge opportunity in front of it, it's sort of everybody uses the gasoline on a fire type of metaphor. That is what they're for. So outside of them, I know one of the areas that you have a ton of experience in is government grants and non-dilutive funding. So if you could take a moment to one, explain really quickly what non-dilutive means in this context, and then just give us kind of a broad overview about government grants, because I know they're a big mystery to most founders out there who don't even know if
right.
they exist.
So I'll start with the easy question, non-dilutive.
Hmm.
Non-dilutive simply means no equity is taken.
Right.
So non-dilutive funding is the antithesis of VC funding, where you're not diluting your shares or diluting your ownership by bringing on partners in exchange for capital.
Right. So in
So,
that example, that $1 million you gave, if it was non-dilutive, you wouldn't get your 49%. You get 0%. So so there are government grants that are non-dilutive. What are those like? Why do they even exist in the first place?
well, the non-dilutive government grants are really, again, for early stage tech companies. It's very
Mm,
hard, and there are very few government grants for-profit companies that aren't in the tech space. And I
okay.
think that one of the ways that we need to level set thinking about government funding is that the government is funding entrepreneurs working in spaces that are good for the country.
Mm,
So,
what a concept, huh?
Yeah. That these are not necessarily things like SBIR, STTR grants, small tech, the tech transfer grants for small businesses are
Hmm.
again really focused on critical technologies that the government is looking for staying competitive in, in the global political arena, really.
Sure.
And so they're investing in companies that could create systems, technology, whatever it is that the government feels it needs for national security.
Hmm.
Most of these non-dilutive government grants are not around economic development. And I think there's a huge misconception among entrepreneurs that government funding is for economic development and to help entrepreneurs grow. And really, that's just not true.
Yeah.
Most non-dilutive government funding is really about the tech transfer aspect and creating the IP, the intellectual property,
Yeah.
um, which is why more than half of those non-dilutive grants come out of the DoD, the Department of Defense.
Ah, well, that's where our
So
895 billion goes.
yeah,
Yeah.
so look, always follow the money trail and then figure out what those funding priorities are. If
Yeah.
the DoD is funding more than half of your grants, it should tell you what type of companies they're looking for. Now,
Yeah.
granted, the DoD buys everything from uniforms and, like it,
Sure.
they're supporting people as well as, but it is about the, military industrial complex
Hmm.
and keeping
Yeah.
that machine going is really where the majority of non-dilutive funding is. So the
Yeah.
SBA oversees America's Seed Fund, and that is $4 billion every year in non-dilutive funding coming from 11 different federal agencies. Um, it's actually mandated that these 11 agencies, which don't include the SBA is kind of the oversight agency.
Hmm.
These 11 agencies, which include Department of Energy, DoD, Jet, like all the
Yeah.
big ones, Commerce, no,
All
actually
the
two.
acronyms.
Yes, all your alphabet soup
Yeah.
um, are giving a percentage of their budget, a very small percentage of their budget, in the form of these non-dilutive grants. But again, they are for the agency's priorities as
Yeah.
determined by the White House. So there's a lot around quantum physics and
Sure.
quantum computing and things like that, like
Yeah. Yeah.
all the big
Yeah.
buzzwords.
To give a couple more examples, I actually was recently helping a company look into government grants. So to kind of sum up what you're saying, so most government non-dilutive grants are really to try to advance innovation in technologies that have some sort of larger, ideally, benefit to our country. A lot of them are defense related. I know, for instance, another good example is a lot in like the biotech and medtech space. So I read there's like a
Absolutely.
massive document, just all these different priority areas. Like, if you have a new form of, renal failure treatment for kidneys or something, there's grant money out there that can potentially help you develop this. But it's really, to your point, it's really to fund things that are not yet feasible technologically, and then to make that breakthrough easier for the company, with the idea being that it'll benefit the wider society in the United States.
Exactly. It's like public education, it's a general good.
Yeah, yeah. So going back to what you're saying, so it sounds like for impact organizations, I know not, nonprofits, I ran one, you've been involved with tons of them. Nonprofits, we live and die off a lot of grants sometimes. So can you tell me a little bit about how a nonprofit should think about government grants? Are there grants out there that are, obviously nonprofits, they don't have equity that they give out, so it's a little bit different. How do they approach and think about government grants?
Well, honestly, the same way. I like to
Okay.
say the only difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit company is how the profits are, given out at the end of the fiscal year. If
Got it.
dividends are, pushed out to shareholders, it's a for-profit company. And if dividends are reinvested within the company, it's a nonprofit. Like that's the biggest difference. And
Yeah,
nonprofits
sure.
that run only on the largesse and generosity of the government or foundations are usually in trouble. I recommend
Let's talk about that. Yeah.
revenue generation, especially now when we're seeing such a shift from major foundations changing their priorities. I
Mm,
think, look at Kauffman Foundation.
sure.
They, used to fund nationally, but they have um, come out with a new strategy this year or last year where they're focusing specifically in their own backyard in Kansas City. And so a lot of the national funding from Kauffman has disappeared. They offer what they're calling a sunset grant because they realize that so many organizations depended on their funding that you can
Yeah.
get like a one-time $100,000 funding to kind of tide you over while you
Right.
find other funders, which
Yep.
honestly is kind of unique and rare. More
That they do
funders,
the sunset part.
yes, more
Yeah.
funders
Yeah.
should look at that,
Yep. Yeah. No, I've
rather than
experienced
just
that
saying,
before.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, so sunsetting means, for those who are unfamiliar, is just they are the sun's going away, so their funding's going away in that priority area. If not, the whole foundation's shuttering. But in this example with Kauffman, it's they've shifted priorities, and so a lot of the people they had been giving grants to annually no longer fit into the new priorities. And so they offer a sunset opportunity, which again, to your point, Maura, is actually very rare. Most of the times, foundations just kind of turn around the next year and like got new priorities, new strategic plan, or new board members, and we're going this other way. And that can be really, really tough on nonprofits who are dependent on big grants. I've seen it happen where, a nonprofit here in Georgia lost a third of its budget overnight because they relied so much on this massive government grant, and it crippled their programs for over a year. And so, with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about government and foundation grants for impact organizations and what they should think about as they approach them. And then maybe some common mistakes you've seen entrepreneurs make when they're thinking about pursuing either government grants or others. So tell us a little about, the difference between a, general overview of a foundation, just so we're level setting for folks. And then we'll dive into how we should think about their grants potentially.
sure. So the difference between a foundation and another type of nonprofit is that usually a foundation has an endowment, and the endowment is invested and generates returns, and those returns are what is distributed as grants. So
Got it.
they don't
Yep.
touch the principal. They're living
Right.
off the interest,
Right.
which
So
pays
yeah,
for operating
usually,
costs as
yeah.
well as which keeps them alive in perpetuity. It's
Yeah.
the same model as universities that have endowments,
Sure.
where
Yeah. So let's take an example. Family X, the former Coca-Cola family, they inherited a bunch of money. They have a bunch of shares in Coke. And so basically what happens, let's say they have $100 million, right? What you're saying is they have an endowment. So they take that 100 million and they invest it in things, largely, stock market, maybe in other investment funds, different things like that. And then every year, those investments ideally yield a return, right? So, and then the foundations are required, I think, right, to give out what, 5%?
5%. You are
Yeah.
absolutely right.
Yeah. So that
5%.
100 million, right, the foundation, and it's usually they have a board typically. The board's typically made up of descendants of the family if it's a family foundation, or prominent individuals in the community, or both. And their responsibility, to your point, is they usually have a staff, typically smaller, and then they're responsible for doling out, in this case, 5% on their endowment. So 5 million of the 100 million each year, to different nonprofit entities.
Right.
And there are rules, right? They can't really give money to for-profit entities. In fact, almost all of them say that on their websites. I think that's not even
Yes.
allowed, right?
Right. So when you're talking about impact organizations, we should be careful to delineate, there are social impact for profits, and they're not always, it depends on how they're using the money, really. But unless you're
Sure.
going to get into the weeds with an organization, they're just going to say nonprofits.
Right.
And
Right.
remember, the invested money, if it returns 8%, they're giving away 5, the other 3 goes back into the endowment gets larger.
Yeah, which is very convenient, right? This is actually a way that a lot of them grow their wealth over time and employ a couple of people and also, as anybody who lives in a city knows that has foundations, if you're on the board of a foundation, it gives you a certain cachet, access to certain networks, and obviously you have some influence. Now all of a sudden, because you have access to capital, you got a lot of people coming in and asking you for it, right? So when thinking about grants, so we have foundation grants, we've got government grants. Are there government grants available to nonprofits?
There are plenty of government grants available to nonprofits depending on who you're helping.
Okay.
So again, just like, in the previous example where it was tech focused for VC and tech focused for that non-dilutive funding, the grants that you're eligible for depend on the mission of your nonprofit.
Got it.
So if you're running a nonprofit that helps veterans, or helps veterans get jobs, then there could be a lot of funding for you coming from the Department of Labor, coming from, all the different agencies that support veterans or support workforce development, the social services, and nonprofits that augment the social safety net.
Yep.
There is, funding available. If
Got it.
you're, so it depends on what your nonprofit does.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And there are state level grants too, I should say, but a lot of this
and
is
municipal
yeah.
level grants.
Yeah, yeah. But like, so for an example, the nonprofit that I was involved in, was co-founder of many years ago. We were education. We were focused on college access and support through high school. And so there were a couple of grants from the federal government that kind of passed through the states that we were aligned with priority wise. But one of the things that you and I have talked about offline is, when is it appropriate for an organization, in this case, nonprofits we're talking about, to actually go for a government grant? Because I think most people don't understand that, the classic phrase where it's like nothing's for free, right? Like everything has strings attached. And government grants, one of the things that they seem to have a lot more of than most foundation grants are reporting requirements, right?
Yes,
So,
because they're giving away taxpayer money.
right,
And so
right.
they are beholden to taxpayers. That also tends to make them more risk averse, which is
Mm,
why, startup nonprofits in their first couple of years that don't have stability, it's
yep,
much harder for them to get the grants. If
yep,
you're going after government funding, you have to show that you are sustainable, financially stable. There's a lot of additional kind of, paperwork or standard operating procedures that need to be in place. And you're right, these grants come with heavy reporting requirements, which require a certain internal capacity,
right.
which is
Yeah.
why you see a lot of grants going to universities,
Mm,
because
yep,
universities have the infrastructure
yep.
to uh, to meet those demands for reporting requirements.
Yeah, yeah. So to kind of unpack that a little bit, a lot of these grants. So let's say you're going for a big grant, half a million, $1 million from the government for, again, we're talking about nonprofits in this case. A lot of times, the bigger the grant, usually the more reporting is required. Because to your point, Mara, this is taxpayer dollars. And so there's always a lot of accountability that needs to be at least reported on so that if anything ever were to occur, they go back and double check. If not, keep you honest in the moment. But to your point, some of these grants are so large in terms of reporting requirements that they actually require that you have and explain your grant management process, right? Like who's going to be the grant management, like, and or some of the budget for this grant has to be used on a grant manager, because they just require you to submit like monthly reports or quarterly reports, track a
Yeah.
lot of data, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, and a lot of data, not just the metrics or outcomes of the program that you're running, but the financial tracking and data, which can be
Right,
quite complex.
right. Where
And
are
it
all the
has to be
dollars
reported
going?
on in their
Yeah.
format and effort reporting, because most organizations will have multiple grants. So people will be divided and their
Hmm.
salary might come from 4 or 5 different grant sources. So the
Right.
effort reporting kind of allocates a percentage of the person's time and therefore a percentage of their salary, their fringe benefits, like
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
Um,
And so for early stage folks, who's largely our target audience here, I always say this. It sounds like we're in agreement generally. If you're an early stage nonprofit, I personally tell you to avoid grants, especially government backed ones, because usually you don't have anywhere near the track record to even win it, let
right.
alone the capacity to manage it if you did, right?
I'm going to give you an asterisk.
Okay.
So many government grants right now require collaboration and
Mm,
um,
that's
they
a good
want a
point.
consortium
Yeah.
of or a collective impact model. I would say that being a subcontractor, the sub to a larger organization's, prime application is an
Yep.
excellent way to kind of get a feel for the grant, get some experience, and get some money without having that administrative burden.
Yep.
So a lot of times these very large grants require multiple organizations. So
Yeah.
this is where
That's
your
fair.
network really matters
Yeah.
because if you can find out who's applying, who in your ecosystem is applying for the grant, and then figure out what you can offer in
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
larger picture, you can get a piece of the grant, which then gives you experience because when you
Right.
do grow and you go to apply for the grant yourself, you can say that you were part of this grant or
Mm.
that grant,
Yeah, and that
and you
track
can
record is
get
super
funding.
important. Yeah,
It is because all most of the federal grants actually have a past performance section where you have to
okay.
detail how you've performed with grants of a similar size or in similar nature.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so this is again
So,
goes back to how government grants are usually the most conservative financial instrument you can go after because again, they're trying to do everything in their power to make sure you don't take the money and go spend it on a night at the club, which we've all seen happen one way or the other. But so I actually, to give you a quick story, so I experienced this with my nonprofit early on. It was actually, I think it's a good example of how government grants sometimes can come with so many strings attached that it ends up getting too complicated. So we, United Way here in Atlanta, got some grant from the government to specifically provide, I'll just say education support opportunities for very specific like zip codes in our city, right? And my organization was working with the high school in those zip codes. And so we were like, oh, this is perfect. Like we can be, one of the essentially service providers that they fund because that's very much what United Way does. They thought it was great. So they're like, yeah, cool. So the grant was going to be for up to $50,000, right? And we're like, great. Well, we've already got the school on board. We've recruited kids. And as we went forward, they kept coming back to us. This is the United Way grant manager being like, actually, there's another sort of wrinkle to this. We need to, for instance, get the addresses of the students in the program, like in your program, so that we can make sure they're from the zip codes that the grant is allocated for, right? Because so United Way applied to the government saying, we'll help these zip codes. The government's like, cool, make sure you do, and tell us who's there. And otherwise, if it's not for people in those specific zip codes, you can't use the money on them, right? And so we thought, okay, great, yeah, let's get the addresses of the kids. Cool. So we had like a group of 20, but out of that group of 20, because of how schools and transiency happens and people live kind of all over the city sometimes, I think it was only two out of the 20 ended up being in the very specific zip codes. And, for reasons out of our control, not obviously out of the kids'
right.
control. And so we ended up only getting, I think it was like $2,000 of that 50. And it took months. It's months to even figure it out. Meanwhile, we're already finishing the program up. So those are the kinds of like complications that can occur with some of this government funding.
Right. And that's why you want to, definitely have contracts looked over. If you signed a contract with United Way and that wasn't spelled out, but then again, you can't necessarily go after an organization like United Way.
Yeah, and it was one of those things where, in practice, what happens, and this is how this happened, was they had just gotten this thing and they needed to turn it around and implement quickly. They knew us, we knew them, we kind of saw each other at an event. we started talking. They're like, "Oh, this would be perfect." And we had some email follow-ups, and we're all in agreement. So as a new nonprofit, or newer at the time, we're obviously excited, right? We're like, "Oh wow, 50K, like that's huge." And so we're, they're like confirming it via email, and so as founders, I know how excited you can get, right? But I've learned, to your point, it's great to get a yes on funding, but until that contract is there with the details and the money's in your account, I wouldn't even consider it counted at all. Like, you got to see that through. I've had multiple instances where we were promised money of a big way, and it came back either zero or a very, very small fraction, because the people
Right.
promising it didn't actually know all of the details yet of all of the requirements. So again, another reason why, if you're especially early stage nonprofit, be wary. Definitely, most likely you should avoid going it alone, trying to get a grant from the government, just because it's going to take a lot of time, and you're probably not going to get it, because you don't have the track record, you don't have the financial history. Um, but if you can collaborate, to your point, Maura, that's a great way in. Just make sure you're very clear on the requirements of the grant, so you can know you can
Right.
actually get the money, right?
And, I think that nonprofits also need to diversify their revenue streams.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can't only rely on grants. You should probably, and the other thing we haven't spoken about is grants are restricted funding.
Mm-hmm.
So most funding sources, with the exception of like Mackenzie Scott, is getting a lot of, you know, I mean, yes, she's
Unrestricted.
giving away billions of dollars, but
Yeah.
they're unrestricted gifts, meaning the organization can use the money in the way it sees fit. They can
Yep.
use it for operating expenses, they can use it for salaries, they can use it for whatever. Most
Right.
government grants they spell out exactly what you can and can't use the money for. There, it's considered restricted dollars. And
Yep.
they often put a cap on the percentage that can be used for overhead or salaries or
Right. Yeah.
things like that. So the point of telling a nonprofit to figure out how to generate its own revenue is so that there are unrestricted dollars,
Right. Right.
dollars that the leadership of the nonprofit can decide how to spend, without anyone else's input.
Right.
They're
And this
not
is just for,
beholden.
right. I mean, this isn't just for government grants too. A lot of
Oh,
foundation
no,
grants are the same way in terms of
absolutely.
restrictions. So in, most basic sense, typically what I've seen is, you know, there's operating budget. So to your point, an organization needs to pay for overhead, right? Like things like legal expenses, usually staff who's not like fully in a program role,
Right.
that kind of stuff. And the challenge is that most foundations and a lot of government grants tend to say, okay, well, you can either not use this money for the operating at all, or you can only use a tiny piece of it. And the rest has to go to your program budget, which
Right.
is what everybody, the idea is that they want to make sure they're funding impact, like actual service to people, so that you're not just raise salary up with a ton more operating expenses. It is kind of a holdover from like sort of an older era. Now it's, you see it a lot more now, where it's like a lot of nonprofits are like, how are we supposed to do this work if we can't pay ourselves? And then I can tell you this quick side story. So I was at Georgia does this, like, I think it's every 2 years, like a big conference of all foundations. Hopefully none of them watch this, but so it's this big conference, or luncheon, I guess, and it coincides with the release of this Georgia report on the state of foundations or something. And at it, they had a panel. Two of the people on the panel were heads of family foundations. One of them was the head of a well-established nonprofit. It's been around for many, many years. And we get to the question and answer portion. And granted, everybody in the room, I'd say 95%, are representatives of family foundations across Georgia. There's only like 5% of us who are actually like nonprofits and service providers that were just kind of there to learn. And we get to the Q&A portion, and a gentleman seated not too far behind me raises his hand, and he says, "Hey, so I started a new organization, 12 months ago, and I'm finding it really difficult to get grant money to pay myself and my other staff person to actually like do this work so we can actually grow what we've been doing. What but because no one wants to fund operating expenses, what do you suggest that we do? And, everybody in the room knows this situation. The person on the panel who had been around, well, she's been around a long time in this area, in this space. She says, well, look, this is where you need to get a little creative with your budgeting and accounting and find ways to classify more of your time and your staff's time as programmatic so that we can give it to you. And, so if you spend 40% of your time as the founder on delivering the programs themselves, put 40% of your salary into the programs. Now, that is a very practical thing. Great. But it's also wild to me that the entire family foundation funding apparatus is in the room and we're all agreeing that, hey, we're just going to pretend that this is like, we're just going to sort of all fool each other when we could just make the decision. You know what? Why don't we just raise the cap of how much we put into operating, right? Why don't we just help people pay salaries? And I think more folks are starting to do that, but are you
Yes,
seeing
I
that?
agree. There's definitely a movement in philanthropy, more trust-based. I believe it's
Mm.
being called trust-based
Oh,
philanthropy,
that's nice.
where if you believe in an organization's ability to get the job done, then just give them the check and
Right.
back off and let
Yeah.
them do the job.
Right.
If you trust them with your money, then actually trust them. And
Yeah.
the nice thing about this idea is that it comes with loosening of the reporting structure as well. So it comes with less friction in the application. It comes
Mm.
with more ability to, budget for yourself and your organization and less time spent on reporting. So
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
a wraparound idea.
Yeah. It
Um,
took them a while. They had to come up with the marketing term for it before they
yeah.
could actually do it. So instead of unrestricted, we're calling it trust based, which is very nice. Okay, let's switch gears here and go back to our for-profit founders for a minute. And I want to talk about debt and equity as funding options. This is one of those things that, especially if you're more traditional, like small business entrepreneur who's just trying to start something for yourself, and you don't have these sort of unicorn aspirations, you usually need a little bit of capital to get things moving, maybe. And so, let's talk about, debt. We talk about debt. We're talking about loans essentially, where you have to pay back a certain amount of interest on the loan over time, typically. But, debt and equity are two financing options usually. And so I'd love for you just to tell us generally, what are some factors maybe a founder should think about when trying to consider what options to go for, and how they should look at their situation.
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is that between 75 and 80% of founders put their own money to start the
Hmm.
company, and that less than 5% of new companies apply for SBA funding, and less than 1% actually get it. So if you think you're going to start your business with an SBA loan, you're not.
Woof. Okay. Is that just because the competition is so much and the pool is small, or what do they
It's
look for?
really, risk tolerance again.
Hmm.
Some of that is industry specific. I actually bought my first business with a $500,000 SBA. So I know I just said you don't get it.
Yeah.
But what I had was the real estate.
Mm.
So the SBA and traditional or even CDFIs, if you're going to go into debt, they're going to want some sort of collateral.
Right. Yep.
You're
Yep.
either going to have to give up equity or collateral. You don't get money for nothing.
Right. Right. Yep.
So, because I was buying a business that I'd been the manager of, I was
Mm.
considered very safe because I knew the business, I had been the manager, I was running it,
Yep.
and I was buying not only the business but the real estate,
Right. And why is that
which
real estate important in this calculation for them?
because that's what acted as the collateral.
Got it. Yep.
And
So
not
that's
only
the
was I
asset.
buying,
Yeah.
yes,
They could
it was
take
an
back
asset
if it
that
doesn't
they
work out.
with real value. So
Yeah.
a hard asset. And I still had to use my home as collateral too. So not
Wow.
only did I
Yeah.
use the building of the business, I also had to use the equity in my home.
Yeah. Right. And this is like any loan, right? Like people, they want to make sure you're going to pay it back.
Yes.
And so even for a business, doesn't matter how great your idea is, doesn't matter how pretty your brochures are, your website is. It's like at the end of the day, when you're talking about getting money from somebody who's a financier, they care about numbers and they care about risk. And so if you
Yes.
don't have the numbers and you don't have the collateral to ensure that if things go wrong, they'll get something back,
Right.
it's unlikely that you're going to qualify for some of these things.
Absolutely. So credit score. So one of the things that I always talk to founders about is where are you as a person? Like forget
Mm,
about your business for a second.
yeah, yeah,
How stable are you personally?
yeah,
Like I meet a lot of people who think, starting a business while they're also in personal flux or transition,
yeah,
moving to a new city or,
yep,
going through a major life change, getting
sure,
divorced or whatever it is.
yeah,
People tend to want a fresh start, and starting a business seems like a fresh start.
mm, yeah,
Don't do that.
right,
Just don't do that. You
yeah,
want to start a business after you have the money. You want to start the business after you have the finances in place for the business.
mm,
You don't actually want to start a business if you don't know how you're going to pay for it.
mm. Yeah,
So,
that's a tough call for a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs out there, as someone who's done that before. But you're absolutely right. I actually was just recording something yesterday about a book that I read recently. It's called The Unicorn's Shadow, or In the Unicorn's Shadow. It's all about common myths that founders and investors all operate under, not realizing the data actually supports the opposite. So one of those myths, to your point, is that this idea that to be successful as an entrepreneur, you need to quit your job, right? You need to like, or drop out of school. See that all the time. Because, our culture has these stories that we love to tell over and over, but the stories are anomalies. Like Mark Zuckerberg is an anomaly. In fact, the
yes,
vast majority of successful business owners start their business from a place of at least financial stability, right? Because that way they can take smaller risks and slowly figure out if a business is even there, right? You got to
right,
really like you want to make it so you're not going to live on the streets if it goes bad, even though that happens.
right. And, I mean, why do most marriages break up? Because of money.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
going, a failed business or a business failure or whatever it is going to have an impact not just on your financial life, but in
Yeah.
all aspects of your life.
Oh yeah, it's psychological. I mean, I've had a failed business and it has a huge impact on you personally, just your
Absolutely.
confidence, your psyche, and all of the ramifications after that. And so it's, I've seen some, I think I even told you this story before, but I was in a little sort of like an accelerator kind of program. And there was a person in the program who was trying to start this nonprofit. And somehow she kind of got up and kind of shared her background, and she had gone through a lot of hardships financially growing up. She had experienced homelessness with her mom, and really had to like find a way to get herself on her feet, made it through school and all that kind of stuff. And but then she did this thing which just baffled me. She said, but this program, which was it was a very light program. It was not very intensive. She's like, this program and you guys made me so confident that I've decided I'm going to go all in on this idea. I've got $5,000 in savings and I'm going to jump into this nonprofit full time. And I'm going to have to make it work. Right. And so this in there is this, you know, entrepreneur archetype, this ethos that we think makes sense, where it's like, I just got to jump in and figure it out. And that's true. You got to figure it out. But that doesn't mean you have to burn the ships, right? Like, this is not, you're not a big company with a ton of money to fall back on.
Right.
Um, but what was so appalling to me was that when she said this, everybody just starts
I was
clapping.
going to say everybody applauded
Yeah,
instead
it's
of
like,
saying, "Are you
wow.
insane?"
Yes,
Yeah.
when I started my first nonprofit with two other guys, the most common question we got in the first like month was, "Are you guys working on this full time?" And it was with that level of skepticism because they're like, a nonprofit of all things is like you're not even going to take home the profits if you make them. And so two of us had actually quit our jobs to do it because we wanted to go full time on it. And it did take us a while. I think it took us probably a year, maybe 10 months to even get any money for ourselves. And we're talking about like, I think that first year I made like $6,000 from the nonprofit. Luckily, I was in my early 20s, Spartan living, didn't really spend money on anything. It saved a bunch for my first job. But yeah, it takes usually 3 or 4 times as long to get anything off the ground. So, coming from a place of stability is the ideal way to do this.
And you need money to start a business. I see so
Yeah.
many founders who like don't have money and they're like, well, I'll just start making money and then I'll have money. And I'm like,
Right. Yeah.
think you understand what's coming first here, the chicken or the egg.
Yeah,
Um,
especially in today's world, right, where it's not as much about, door knocking and just like going to open events and stuff. It's much more about your online presence. Can you actually like get through to people because there's so much noise? Like you might have the best product, or the best service, or the best mind in the world, but if you can't find a way to market yourself and actually generate some leads to some business, it's going to be a long slog. It's really, really hard.
I'm going to stop you right there, Ian. I don't care how good your idea is. Businesses need to solve problems. I
Yeah,
see too many people starting businesses because they're passionate about their idea,
right.
but
Yeah,
their idea isn't solving a problem and it isn't fulfilling a need that
yeah,
people have.
right.
Therefore, they have a hobby, not
Yeah,
a business.
yeah, yeah.
So I think that that is really needs to be emphasized that
Totally.
I don't
Yeah.
care what you love to do, and I don't care how good you are at it.
Mm,
If you're not solving my problem, I'm
right.
not interested.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And that's a topic for many, many other episodes, which I will certainly get to. But yes, 100% emphasize it to everybody. Like once you start pursuing it. So everybody, what we do is right. We come up with the idea before defining the problem itself, because creating the idea is really fun, right? It's like it's intoxicating. Culture sort of romanticized it. You come up with this idea and you imagine everybody on the planet using your idea or doing your thing, and you build this kind of vision in your head. And you're like, I could see this working. It's like, well, no, your imagination is just really good. Um, and
Yeah.
and I'll tell you, mine is one of the best, I think. And I've been there. But then when you actually get in front of people, and the easiest way to do this is to look at yourself, right? And how you view products and services that come across your desk. Because like most people, when they get a sales email from someone or someone tries to pitch them something, your level of skepticism already is super high just because, like, if they're trying to sell me something, they want my money. And so you just got to be realistic about if you're not, the products that I buy, I know are going to do exactly what I need them to do to solve whatever problem I have. And that's why I buy them. But it's that I'm convinced, I know it. And maybe I'll take a chance on something new, but it has to be super clear as to why. But to your point, a lot of people start with the idea and think, oh, people will hear my vision and want to be a part of it. It's like people don't really give a shit about our visions, part of my lives,
No,
right? They
no, they
care
do
much
not.
more about their own lives and their own pain points and solving
Yeah.
those.
People are, we are inherently a little bit on the selfish side.
Yeah, well,
For
it's instinctive too. I mean, we're out here, we're all instinctively motivated to survive and do our own thing. So yes, we're 100% in agreement there. So let's get a couple more questions here before we wrap up. So let's talk about early stage businesses when we're talking about managing cash flow and building financial resilience, how that's critical. And this goes for nonprofits too. So how can founders think strategically about a funding strategy early on? And nonprofits and for profits obviously uh, differ slightly, but in general, and maybe that's too broad of a question, but I'm curious how you react to that. How can founders really think about the financing, the funding they're going to need to grow a business or a nonprofit?
Well, I'm going to go with for profit because I do think there's way different startup mechanisms.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, I think that after you've validated your idea and you know you have a feasible
Mm,
business, like a product that people actually need and will pay for,
right.
what we're really talking about is how to get it off the ground and how to get it to people so they can pay for it.
Mm,
And I think there are lots of different ways that you can do that. Obviously, self-funding is far and away the most common.
yeah.
It depends on when you expect a return on investment, but you can look at, even credit cards. You get one of those cards with like no APR for the first year as like an incentive, and you put
Yeah.
everything on it, and you've got that year. of no interest. Then you just need to pay it off before that year.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so that might get you ten to $20,000. You can sell the product. You can try to get a large order, and
Yeah.
then you can
Pre-sales.
do
Yeah.
like the revenue, revenue funding, where there are companies that if you have the invoice from a reputable company, they
Yep.
will pay you a percentage to kind of be a bridge loan. What you're looking
Yeah.
for at that point is a bridge loan, a loan that
Mm.
just kind of fills that gap from A to B until you
Yep.
get the money. So
Yep.
that's where a line of credit, even a HELOC, if you are lucky enough to own your home, you
Mm-hmm.
can get a line of credit against your home. It's basically like taking out equity, except once you pay the line back, you can use it again. I'm a
Yeah.
big fan of a line of credit
Mm-hmm.
because usually revenue is not stable. And a line of credit, you pay it back when you have the money, and then it's basically there again for you when you need it, if you need
Right.
it.
Sure. Sure.
So I really
Yeah.
like line of credits, and they tend to be a little easier, although a lot less money than most loans.
Yeah. Yeah. Which
Um,
actually can be nice. It's, a lot of times, and there's research that supports this. When you have fewer resources and those constraints, it forces you to do things more simply, more cheaply, not necessarily to sacrifice the quality of what you're delivering product wise, but just to keep your operations simple. A lot of times when people dive in, they want to spend all kinds of money on marketing or on, PR opportunities, all kinds of crap. But in the beginning, especially, it's most important to prove that customers will buy what you're selling. And
right.
and so to explain a little bit about what you were suggesting, um, and I've done this too, where so now there's a whole new group of funders out there, revenue-based funders. So let's say you've got a new product, or you've got a concept for a new product. Let's say you've got a concept for a very simple software tool and you've got the mock-ups, the designs, whatever, and you've pitched it to a company to help them with, it helps them with whatever. The company says, all right, I'll buy that for $30,000 a year. Great. And you need to deliver it to me in 6 months, right? And so what you're saying is there are companies now, and also this goes for credit too, where if you have that signed purchase order, basically, or
Right.
invoice, you can go to them and say, hey, I have $30,000 in revenue that is expected to come in. I need some of that money to actually execute and fulfill this order. And they will give you that money in exchange for some interest. Right. And so it is a great new option. A lot of people shy away from that stuff because I think they think it's nefarious or kind of sketchy to give
Right.
away revenue. It's just the way it sounds, but it's very straightforward.
It is.
And
It's
it
very
does.
stable. I mean,
Yeah.
you're just, the revenue is coming. It's a contract. It's the difference between cash and accrual accounting. Like
Yeah.
most
Sure.
people, especially in the beginning, go with cash accounting because they're looking at cash flow, and
Hmm.
cash accounting does kind of give you a more accurate, up to the minute
Yeah.
picture of your cash flow. So
Right.
you can see why that happens. But
Yeah.
when you're that is all about the phase of growth that your business is in.
Yeah. Yeah.
The right option is the right option for you at that point in time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that that's, really important to keep in mind. And,
Yeah.
you don't want to make a long-term decision, put a long-term solution into place for a short-term problem. You want to,
Mm.
you want to
Yeah.
make sure that you understand what type of problem you're solving for.
Yeah,
To
that's a great way to put it. Yeah. It's one of those things too. I think this applies to when you're seeking investment as a startup founder as well. You really want to know what you're going to use the money for. And that money should be tied to things that will drive revenue, right? Will earn you more money. Too often, and this is so common in the startup space, where you've got founders who think that it's sort of the opposite. They pitch for money so that they can then go figure out how to turn their idea into profits. Now, very early stage, you can get that sometimes. Family and friends round, pre-seed round, it is more conceptual than funding a business because you don't really have anything yet. But generally, if you have a product, you want to get to a place where you're starting to get traction. You're starting to sell it. People want it. And you need money in order to grow and sell it to more people and keep growing. Too often I see founders just seeking capital because they think the capital is going to solve their problem of getting customers. When in reality, it's like you have to prove you know how to get customers, and then we'll give you the capital to get more of them that same way, right? And I think that's somewhere it's one of those things where the startup culture around fundraising, you see all these headlines like so and so raises $50 million, like Series B or whatever. It's so
That is,
intoxicating.
still the VC world. Like
Yeah,
that is not realistic. These like Series A, Series B funding, I mean, that's not what most people are doing,
right, right.
you know?
And again, the vast, we're not talking about like 50-50. We're talking about 99% of businesses do not get venture capital. And the
Correct.
1% that does, I actually was talking to somebody who works in this space too. He told me this crazy thing. He's like, I think it's 99% of businesses don't get venture capital. And of
Mhm.
the 1%, half of that percent, so half of them are based in California, and
Yes.
the other half are everywhere else. And even out of those, I think it's only like 50% end up like becoming profitable.
Mhm.
And so it's a very, very small,
Yeah.
sect of folks.
And if you're not a white man, forget about it. Because out
Yeah,
of that
yeah, no.
1% getting venture capital, like 98% of them are white men.
Yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely.
if you're not a white man in California, you really shouldn't even be thinking about venture
Yeah,
capital.
and it's just not I 100% agree, because what it too is it warps how you think about your business,
It
right?
does.
Like it
It makes you feel
forces
bad
you.
about yourself. And
Yeah,
I'm
I
like,
mean, yeah. And as a
why
white
on
guy,
God's
I've
green
gotten
earth?
turned down a ton too. And no matter anybody who's coded for funding and you get turned down, even if it's like a bland foundation email, it's like, hey, we had a lot of great applications. Sorry, whatever. It sucks, and it can hurt your ego and hurt your confidence. And so why put yourself through that if it's not even right for your business, right? And
Well, I
that's
will
kind of
tell you the best story, my best story, not the best story.
yeah.
My best story about understanding funder priorities and how things get funded is when I was working at the SBA. So here I am managing a $7 million program called the Growth Accelerator Fund out of the Office of Investment and Innovation. So it is an ecosystem building grant meant
Okay.
for entrepreneur support organizations to build relationships, specifically build relationships with smaller organizations that are reaching those hard to reach founders, people of color, traditionally marginalized communities, whether it's
Sure. Rural
indigenous, women,
areas, yeah, all that kind of
whoever,
stuff. Yeah.
people who are shut out. It's a door to get them into the ecosystem so they can access the resources of the ecosystem. So we have the money, and this was actually a prize program, not a grant, which
Okay.
means there was so much less friction. Like the application didn't involve submitting a big budget form. The reporting requirements were super simple. I mean, this could have is a great on ramp. We've really thought of
Yeah.
this program as an on ramp into federal funding because
Nice.
it would give you a past performance, but it wasn't
Didn't
nearly as
require that as
complicated.
much. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm. Very frictionless. Um, but when it came time to make the decision, so this is how the decision making went. We had a rubric, so
Hmm.
we had it standardized and a point system. So we had three judges look at the rubric and judge for each of them, and then we averaged all the scores. And
Hmm.
then we looked at the outliers, like if there was like one judge who went super high or super low, then we took a second look at it so that
Okay.
we kind of accounted for any, awkwardness.
Sure.
Then we ranked them, top quarter, middle, whatever.
Yeah.
And then we started looking at the top 25%.
Okay.
And we had, a ridiculous number from California, a ridiculous number from Massachusetts, and
Hmm.
we wanted to make sure that we funded across the country. We
Yeah.
wanted to make sure that we funded across technologies. We wanted to make sure that we funded across the demographics that they were helping.
Sure.
So we wanted to make sure that there was a good mix.
Yeah.
Um, and to get the mix that we wanted, we actually dipped down into that below, like right at 50%.
Okay. Yeah.
So there were people in the top 10% who did not get funded because we only had two applications from Nebraska or wherever it was. That is an
Yeah,
example.
yeah,
I'm not talking about Nebraska. I think
sure.
we got zero applications from Nebraska, which means those states that only put in one application got bumped up into consideration regardless of where they fell in the
Yeah,
percentile scale.
right.
And so many times we, said to people, oh, you have a great idea, but we can't fund you. And it just made me wish that people talk to each other in the ecosystem, because we had like 5 applications for green technology in Southern California, in like the same little place in Southern California doing like
Mm,
green ocean tech. And I'm like,
yeah,
we're not funding 5 of you. Even if
right.
your 5 ideas are amazing, you
Yeah,
should
yeah,
be working together.
sure.
Like, there's no way to fund all 5 of you and have it be an equitably, distributed
Yeah,
funding. Like,
right, right. Yeah,
yeah. And so I will say, like, that's one of those things about rejection. I no longer take it in any way about me or my idea or whatever,
yeah,
because I saw it from the
yeah, yeah,
inside,
yeah.
and it has nothing to do with the validity or quality of my idea. It could
Mm-hmm.
be as simple as they had lots of applications from Philly, because we
Mm-hmm.
have a huge ecosystem here, and
Yeah,
they could only pick one. And so they picked one that they knew the best.
yeah.
Because again, that government thing about risk aversion and making sure the organization that you're giving money to can deliver the expected outcomes and outputs,
Yeah.
is number one. Because at the end of the day, the last thing you want is to get called up to the hill, and
Mm,
have to justify the decisions that you made
right, right.
because there was a failure.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Um,
it's a great story because, I've seen it too. I've been on the other side of giving out money as well. And, a lot of times it just comes down to the priorities. It comes down to, other little things that have nothing to do with the applicant, or the applicant could never know, which is
yeah.
unfortunate, but is the reality. And I will say that and I lost my train of thought, so I'm not going to say anything. But I want to use that as a transition into this conversation about economic equity, because you've spent much of your career focused on how to continue to grow economic equity, especially in the entrepreneurial space. So, how can founders from underserved communities better position themselves to access these different funding options?
Well, this is a very interesting time.
Hmm.
With the new administration coming in, there are a lot of changes. And what we've seen in
Right.
this past year is a very big backlash against DEI and DEI initiatives, and so many corporations walking back promises that were made after, Ferguson and George Floyd, and all of these shocking events that
Yeah. Yeah.
kind of catalyzed a movement for, social justice, economic and racial justice. They're totally tied. You can't really talk about social justice without economic justice, because
Yeah.
economic justice is what kind of gives a person the ability to participate in society. When
Definitely.
you look at who votes, it is people with resources.
Right. Yeah.
People with resources and education, whether that's the resource of time or whatever it is, that's who
Yeah.
votes.
Right. Right.
And if you don't vote, you're not necessarily going to be represented. So
Hmm.
I won't go into why our democracy is failing,
Hmm.
unless you want to later.
Yeah. We'll do
And
that for the underground podcast.
um, I would say that we are seeing changes, and one of the changes we're seeing is a move away from being able to specify that you're serving a Black community. When the Fearless
Right.
Fund got sued, when
Yeah.
Hello Alice got sued, it really scared a lot of funders who obviously do not want to be sued for being
Yeah,
discriminatory.
right. Just
They
to
want
give
to
a
be
context, yeah. So for folks who aren't familiar with what you're referring to, the Fearless Fund, correct me if I'm wrong, was a fund specifically for Black women entrepreneurs, correct? And
yes.
that was one of their main priorities, if not the main. And it was because Black women get, I think it's the least amount of funding for ventures out of any demographic. And so this fund was created in the wake of some of this.
Out of private money, which I think is very important to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah,
This
that's
was
it is
not
important.
public money. This was
Right.
private
This
money.
is individuals who put in their own money saying we support this as an initiative and we care about this larger problem we're trying to solve. And then they got sued by we'll just say, more conservative
A right
folks.
wing,
Yeah.
think tank kind of that's
Yeah,
up front.
who basically are saying, look, this is racism or discriminatory because you're not letting not like people who are not black women apply to this. So it's that reverse racism stuff, which again, if you look at the
There's no such thing as reverse racism.
yeah, it doesn't make any logical sense because it's not yeah, that's a again not
Racism is a power structure, and black women have no power. I mean,
right. And
so
so, but they unfortunately the Fearless Fund lost this lawsuit, correct? Right? I think, or it's
it was
maybe it's
not
still
a win or
under.
loss, but they had to make some changes. They negotiated a change, but it was enough
Yeah,
to really,
to your point,
um,
right? There's a lot of other funders who were watching this case and who
including the
had
government, because people love to sue the government.
yeah. And that is, one of the downsides of a, litigious society is that people get nervous about having to deal with lawsuits in every sector.
Well, they
When I,
should. They're super expensive and time
yeah.
consuming, and
And
they are a resource drain.
right. And so basically, what you're saying is these lawsuits have made a lot of these big companies and foundations and other folks who have had been funding DEI initiatives, one that specifically try to help start to balance out or at least put a little bit more money towards populations that had not been getting funding. A lot of those groups now have sort of taken a step back. They sort of changed their
They're changing their
language,
language. But one of the
deprioritize,
things, though,
which,
we're seeing is a move towards location,
mm,
because location. So what we're seeing is using income as basically a proxy marker.
yeah, which goes back to your point about economics being
Right.
very much
So
intertwined.
now instead of helping, black women, they're going to help poor people. And so they
Right.
pick the census tracts and geography, just like you were
Mhm.
talking about with the education and the school. They're
Yep.
going by zip codes. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's another reason that you're really seeing a focus on location,
Mm-hmm.
foundations shifting to working in their own backyards, and
Kaufman
a
being an
lot of
example. Yeah.
regional based funding. Like look at Tech Hubs, look at Recompete. There are
Mm-hmm.
These are regionally based funding programs that work on the cluster idea, creating an industry sector cluster in a
Mm-hmm.
very specific location.
Got it. Yeah.
And the location is becoming a proxy for the other markers. So they're using zip codes, census tract, and they're using income. So
Yep.
basically, instead of focusing on race or gender or ethnicity, they're focused on income, which cuts across
Yep.
those
Right.
three.
Right.
And
Right.
so really, it's more challenging for this is the trade-off. There are programs that will help you if you are, in one of these economically distressed regions.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're calling them now.
Yeah.
Economically distressed populations.
Uh-huh.
Um, but there a lot of, this is where statistics are so weird. So a couple years ago, the SBA made a big deal about how many black women were starting businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So many black women, the like fastest growing business owner demographic, black women.
Yep.
But when you talk to black women, which I love to do,
Mm-hmm.
what they'll tell you is that they're starting businesses because they can't stand their corporate job. You have
Mm-hmm.
brilliant women who
Yep.
could have had phenomenal careers in large corporations who cannot deal with the misogyny and racism, who are
Sure.
starting their own businesses instead, which is inherently risky,
Yeah.
you
Right.
know? But what
I've
they have
already,
going
as
for
you're
them
talking, I'm
is
thinking of like a half dozen friends of mine who fit that description perfectly. They're just like so fed up with like the bureaucracy, the politics, and it's not so many organizations are so far from being merit based,
yes, we
Yeah.
don't live in a meritocracy regardless of what anybody tells you.
Yeah.
Um, but the SBA is like, black women, it's because there's so much more supports for them. And there
Mm,
are, but when you talk to black women, it's not the supports that are available that made them start a business.
right,
It
right.
was something else entirely. And yes, they may
Yeah.
have used those supports, but I think it's really important. This is why I like to talk to people. I'm a qualitative, researcher rather than a quantitative researcher.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, because the reasons are really different
Yeah.
than
Yeah. The
what is
context is so
being
important.
touted. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And people might hear this and be like, well, what's wrong with more Black women starting their business? Absolutely nothing's wrong
Nothing.
with that. But what to your point is the starting a business, no matter who you are, no matter what your idea is a very risky endeavor. It
Yeah.
does not come with the safety net or the benefits or the
No.
retirement or any or healthcare and all that stuff that corporate jobs can
And it's
provide.
not good for the corporations.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Corporations do better when there are women at the top and women leaders and women on the board. And,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
diversity is a strength for business.
Yeah. I mean, and the
So we're
research
not
is
doing the
pretty
companies
clear,
any
right?
favors. We're not doing the people, and we're not doing individuals, corporations, or,
Yeah. It's not really great for
society.
anyone unless the woman herself happens to build a really successful business that, overachieves where she was. But to your point, it
But it's
doesn't
a
serve
risk.
us. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
it doesn't serve anyone. And these women who have the corporate job, have the network, are the most likely to succeed. They're older, they're experienced. They generally start businesses in an aligned field, if not the same field that they were working in their corporate jobs.
Sure.
They become consultants or those types of things. Um, but it's not. But they're not the ones who can get help because they're not low income. So
Mm,
now you've
right.
got you know
Yeah.
Black
There's this
women.
gap there. Yeah.
Yeah, so now there's this gap because as things shift towards helping low income, if you're not low income, you kind of are a little shut out. I mean,
Yeah. It's just
um,
that much, it's just another little window that's closed and you don't exactly fit anymore. Yeah. And it's the same idea we were talking about earlier with foundations who shift priorities, right? It's like, oh, you're no longer in our priority lane. And so unfortunately, we can't help you this time.
I have to tell you how much I hate foundations. And in general, I think that foundations participate in what's called philanthrocapitalism.
Mm,
So as I was saying, I'm gonna pick on the Gates Foundation for a second.
okay.
Um,
Let's do it.
so Gates Foundation, there's lots of money. The Gates have lots of money. They start a foundation. What they don't do with the money that they give to the foundation is pay taxes on it. So they've
Right.
pulled a huge amount of money out of the infrastructure that
Hmm.
would have, been allocated to resources of
Yep.
the public good that are desperately needed. And then they get to direct those resources.
Right.
So I've got two middle schoolers who kind of grew up doing Common Core math. I was
Okay.
right in the thick of it when Common Core math came out. And I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah.
what? I don't understand this at all.
Yeah.
So that was a privately funded Gates Foundation program.
Mm,
The Gates Foundation thought that they could do this better than the American public education system.
yeah.
And they had enough money to influence the entire public education system
Right.
because they thought as if. So I have a big problem with using these loopholes and then directing the money.
Yeah.
Here in
Yeah. It's
Philadelphia,
massive influence.
it's
Massive influence.
massive. It's outsized influence. I mean, I think billionaires. I think having that much money is immoral.
Hmm.
Um, I have all kinds of feelings.
Sure.
But the whole idea of starting a foundation because you have so much money as a
Right.
person, um, that you are just, using these loopholes to push your private agenda onto the public,
Hmm.
and it's allowed, even if you have
Yeah.
no expertise or experience in that subject.
Right. That's the biggest thing, right? It's like,
Hey,
it's,
because they have enough money. If they didn't have the money, nobody would listen
yeah. Right.
because they
Yeah.
have no expertise or thought leadership
Exactly.
or,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's the tough part, right? It's like, and, we know people who work at foundations and they're
I'm
none of
not
the,
talking about the staff of any foundation.
yeah.
They're
And
all
yeah,
mission driven
exactly.
and not making
Exactly.
enough money and doing great work. I am
Yeah.
talking about the founders of foundations
Sure. Yeah.
who are
Yeah.
the, people endowing these foundations,
Yeah.
and pushing the private agenda on the public,
Yeah.
with
While not
no
paying
checks and
taxes.
balances.
Yeah,
Yes.
while not paying tax on all this
Uh-huh.
money they made, whereas we still have to, the small players like us have to pay, our income taxes and all that stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I'm 100% with you. I think it's and it's one of those things that unless you've really been a part of it, it's hard to truly appreciate what happens. In Atlanta, there's something called the Atlanta Way, which I learned about not too long ago, where there's a history in Atlanta apparently. And I love Atlanta and everybody in Atlanta, so don't hate me. But from what I've understood, there's a history in Atlanta where basically the business leaders, the philanthropic leaders, and the political leaders, they just get together in back rooms and they kind of decide what they want to do, and they all coordinate and align. And now that reeks of like conspiracy theory. But again, like when you're in this, like you realize this is how this happens. It's not even necessarily sinister in intent. But it is certainly not equitable and not fair because just because maybe this person had one successful software tool that made them $100 million or something, and that might be too close to a real example, but I didn't mean it that way. But exactly my point, right? It's like I'm even nervous to describe a fictitious example because it might sound like people in this city who I know have massive influence, right? And now they can direct those funds, and it does influence the programs. It does influence the services because as founders, we try to kind of hew to what we know is going to get us the money we need to keep doing what we're doing. And so sometimes they all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, we'd like you to do it this way, or we'd like you to include this into your program, or try to focus on this population. And
And
it is
that is the
massive
problem
influence.
with taking equity money.
Yeah.
It's the same
Fair.
people you're talking about who will invest for equity.
Hmm.
And then when you sign that contract, you are giving away some portion of control.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, most, equity investors insist on a board seat or
Right.
some
Sure.
sort of, you know, position of influence where they influence the decisions that
Yeah.
are being made for the company.
Yeah, and a lot of times with disastrous results. I mean, there's a example literally in the last month of this company called Bench. It was like a sort of
Yes.
darling in Silicon Valley, and it's an accounting service for a lot of small businesses, startups, and consultancies and stuff. I didn't use it, but apparently it was doing very, very well. But then a couple of years ago, the investors forced out the founder, and all of a sudden had a different strategic priority, and the services quality started to drop precipitously. And then literally around Christmas or a couple days before this past Christmas, that everybody who's on bench, we're talking about like tens of thousands of businesses, get an email from them being, hey, we're closing in 2 weeks. We'll keep an eye out for instructions about how to access your data. And it's like, this is accounting software, right? That is so critical to all these businesses.
Right.
And all of a
And the
sudden, they're
end
just
of the
like,
year.
poof.
And,
Yeah.
it's so that taxes are due, quarterly
Yeah.
taxes are due,
It's wild.
end of year taxes, it's the busiest time.
Yeah. And it's like
Yeah.
Silicon Valley Bank not too long ago either. It's like, this stuff happens. And a lot of times it's because of certain individuals, certain stakeholders who have
Who generally
agendas.
walk away with a giant paycheck for
Right.
their
Yeah.
they've destroyed something and they get paid very well for it.
And they get to go on keep investing in other stuff. Right. It's like
A
we
lot of,
hold investors
people who have gotten
accountable. Like,
VC money and failed get VC money again.
right. Yeah. 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 And not to mention the investors who invest in a bunch of things that don't pan out continue investing most of the time. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here. I appreciate you giving me the time. I want to close out with one last question. If we're talking to an early stage or founder or someone who's just starting out, trying to build a business or a nonprofit, what 2 or 3 actionable steps might you think they should take as it relates to funding or just even thinking about funding? What do you think they should be doing early on?
Examine your business model closely. A lot of people think that the only way to, sell a product is to sell the product. But
Right.
there are other models like subscription-based models or
Yep.
lease-based models where you lease a piece of equipment and then you sell them other parts, or
Sure. Yeah.
like McDonald's is a real estate business. I mean, that's how
Hmm.
it started. McDonald's bought the land, leased it
Right.
to the person owning the franchise, and then sold them all the things they needed.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you don't think about that. there,
Right.
so really seriously look at other business models
Yeah.
besides the simple, manufacture for X, sell for Y.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are multiple levels, multiple models to think about that, and some of them may require much less startup capital. They might be less capital intensive.
Yep.
They might have create a steadier revenue, at least where you have a guaranteed monthly income coming in from
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
types of programs. I would say really understand the difference between cash flow and profits. I
Mm.
see a lot of first time founders getting kind of caught up on revenue coming in and getting super excited about how much revenue
Yeah.
and not putting their expenses against the revenue and realizing that
Right. Right.
they really need to be focused is profit, not revenue.
Mm. Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
revenue is great to have, but if every time you make a dollar, it costs you $1.15 to make that dollar, you are screwed.
Right, right. And the cash flow piece, to your point, is, and having worked in ed tech, I know this as well as anyone. When you get the money for the things you're selling is a big deal. So if you're selling a product to someone immediately and they pay you immediately, that's great. You've got the cash flow immediately. But a lot of times, especially if you're selling to businesses, they have sales cycles, they've got funding cycles, and so
Net
like
90, six
yeah.
months.
Right. They
Coca-Cola
might not
doesn't
pay
care
you
when they
for a
pay you.
while. Yeah. So I sold, I might sell a district a contract in January, but I know I'm not going to get the money in my bank account until July. And so how am I going to pay the bills between now and then? And that's where the cash flow considerations really come into play. One other thing I'll add in to your point about really analyzing business models and thinking differently about where can I create some immediate value to get some revenue going. Another thing that I think we shy so far away from in today's tech-driven world is providing basic services and along with what you're offering. So an example I'll give is the tool that I used to sell in the ed tech space was basically like a data tracker, let's just call it. And so one of the things that we realized was like a lot of teachers and schools didn't even necessarily feel competent enough with data in general and like how to think about data, how to like track it properly. And so we started offering trainings just on data to leverage our expertise while we're building our product. And it's a way to incorporate the product. So it's just another way. It's like you can sometimes get things moving a little bit by leaning on what you know and why you're building the product in the first place. And that can sometimes get you a little bit of cash or a little bit of reputation, plus like an in to show off whatever your tool you're building or service or whatever. So this has been great, Maura. I really appreciate it. I also always appreciate your candor. That is what the Founder Underground is meant about. So I'm really trying to always find perspectives that can really give the real deal, authentic realities to all of our early stage founders out there, whether you're nonprofit, for profit. We're here to support you because we believe in creators, we believe in entrepreneurs, and being on your side versus the financial side. So thank you so much again for joining me.
Oh,
This
Ian,
has
always a
been
pleasure.
yeah, hopefully we'll do it again sometime. And this has been an episode for the Founder Underground podcast, one of my expert guest episodes. And for those folks, we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Bye.